Welcome to Pacific States University's online lecture series for Gen 108, Explorations in the Arts. Today, we are diving into the breathtaking world of 17th century European art. But we aren't just going to look at pretty pictures today. We're actually going to explore the deep historical, political, and religious forces that completely reshaped the artistic landscape of the continent between 1600 and 1700. You'll see firsthand how art is never created in a vacuum, right? It's a direct reflection of the society that produces it. So to really get a handle on this, we're going to take what I like to call a geography of style approach.
Here is our visual syllabus for today's overview lecture. We'll start with a shift from the Renaissance to the Baroque. Then, we'll head south to Italy and Spain for some counter-Reformation drama. Next, we're traveling north to contrast Flanders and the Dutch Republic, before really zooming in on the Dutch Golden Age. And finally, we'll wrap things up with the royal courts of France and England. Let's get into it.
From Renaissance to Baroque.
To really understand the 17th century, you first have to understand what it was leaving behind. The preceding era, the Renaissance, was defined by precision, orderly rationality, and a very calm, calculated form of classicism. Leaving all that calm calculation in the rearview mirror brings us to our core definition for today, the Baroque. It was literally the antithesis of orderly rationality. It was dynamic, it was highly theatrical, it was incredibly ornate. This brand new theatricality basically set the stage for highly emotional, complex, and energetic artwork across the entire continent.
Okay, moving on to Section 2, Italian and Spanish drama. We are starting our journey down in southern Europe, specifically in regions heavily dominated by the Catholic Church. At this time, the Church was undergoing the Counter-Reformation. This was a movement meant to re-energize the Catholic faith in the face of growing Protestantism. And the primary weapon they chose? Art. They wanted to fuel intense religious fervor and inspire absolute, unquestioning devotion. You can actually feel this intense new energy in the architecture of Francesco Borromini. He completely discarded those traditional flat frontispieces of church facades. Instead, he treated buildings almost like sculptures. His church facades are undulating, curving surfaces that create this fluid, seamless transition from the exterior right into the interior. And when you step inside, the interiors just pulsate with energy, featuring these wildly complex domes that seem to grow organically straight out of the curving walls.
Now, we also can't talk about Italian Baroque without bringing up Gian Lorenzo Bernini. He was the greatest Italian Baroque sculptor, but also a completely brilliant architect. In his 1645 masterpiece, The Ecstasy of Saint Teresa, we really see how Bernini marshaled the full capabilities of architecture, sculpture, and painting, blending them all together into one unified, mixed-media space. He did this to create a visceral, overwhelmingly emotional experience for worshippers, and that perfectly aligns with the Counter-Reformation principle of using art to inspire deep devotion and piety.
Meanwhile, over in the realm of painting, Caravaggio was breaking completely new ground. He popularized a technique called tenebrism, which is basically the use of stark, incredibly dramatic contrasts of light and dark. It's like a spotlight in a pitch-black room. But he didn't just change how paintings were lit, he changed who was actually in them. Caravaggio purposefully set sacred religious scenes in everyday, gritty locales, and he populated these divine moments with rough-looking, ordinary, common people. It made the religious stories feel immediate, raw, and just dramatically human.
Moving slightly west over to Spain, we find Diego Velázquez. He's the absolute greatest of the Spanish Baroque painters, and he served as the esteemed court painter to King Philip IV. His 1656 masterwork, Las Meninas, is essentially an incredibly complex celebration of the art of painting itself. Velázquez's mastery of space is just mind-bending here. He effortlessly mixes true physical spaces, mirrored spaces, picture spaces, and even pictures within pictures. It's a brilliant intellectual puzzle wrapped up in all that glorious Baroque theatricality.
Section 3. Flanders versus the Dutch Republic.
Traveling geographically north, we find two neighboring regions that were fundamentally opposed in politics and religion. And as you might guess, that resulted in entirely different artistic outputs. In the 17th century, Flanders remained strictly Catholic and securely under the control of the Spanish monarchy. Because of that, their art was heavily dictated by grand church commissions and aristocratic tastes. But right next door was the Dutch Republic. They were predominantly Protestant and proudly independent. Since they rejected grand Catholic church art, Dutch artists had to rely entirely on private commissions from mercantile citizens. So you have two regions, right, side by side, birthing completely different artistic movements based entirely on their local socio-political environments.
Let's look first at Catholic Flanders. Because of those strong Spanish ties, Flemish Baroque art stayed very closely tethered to the robust Baroque art coming out of Italy. The leading Flemish painter was Peter Paul Rubens. In pieces like his Arrival of Marie de' Medici from the 1620s, Rubens' paintings exhibit true, unadulterated Baroque splendor. He's famous for vibrant color, heavy ornamentation, and these characteristic, robust, foreshortened figures caught in dynamic, swirling motion. It is loud, it is proud, and it is undeniably grand art.
But then we cross the border. 1648, write that date down, it's absolutely crucial. This is the year of the Treaty of Westphalia, which granted the Dutch Republic official recognition of its independence from Spain. With their hard-won independence and their Protestant faith firmly in place, the Dutch officially shifted their primary art patronage away from the church and the monarchy, placing it directly into the hands of prosperous, everyday citizens.
Which brings us nicely to Section 4, the Dutch Golden Age.
This newfound independence, combined with a booming economy driven by worldwide trade and banking, fueled a massive wave of secular, private Dutch art. The undisputed master of this era was without a doubt Rembrandt van Rijn. He tackled a really broad range of subjects, from portraits to religious themes. In his famous 1642 work, The Night Watch, you can clearly see how Rembrandt's oil paintings are renowned for their dramatic impact and incredibly subtle gradations of light and shade. But beyond just his technique, it's really his unmatched ability to convey raw, genuine human emotion that makes his paintings, and his masterful etchings, by the way, so enduringly powerful.
Now, because Dutch artists lacked those massive grand church commissions, they had to be incredibly entrepreneurial. They started carving out niche specializations to appeal to the wealthy middle-class market. Frans Hals produced highly innovative portraits where lively informality replaced those stiff, old formulaic patterns. Jacob van Risdal didn't bother painting idealized Renaissance backgrounds. He specialized in landscapes depicting very specific, recognizable Dutch places. And Peter Claes? He cornered the market on vanitas still lifes. These are meticulous depictions of worldly goods that subtly served as moral reminders of death and the fleeting nature of wealth.
And then, of course, there was Jan Vermeer. Vermeer specialized in a very specific type of genre scene, painting Dutch families inside their serenely opulent homes. His representation of interior spaces and natural light bouncing off surfaces was so astonishingly convincing that we know it depended, at least in part, on his use of an early optical technology called the camera obscura. He captured the quiet, comfortable prosperity of the Dutch Golden Age absolutely perfectly.
But as we leave the bustling, mercantile markets of the Dutch Republic behind, I want to pose a question to pivot our focus for the final section. How does art change when its primary patron is an absolute monarch with unlimited power? Section 5. French and English Classicism. Transitioning away from those middle-class markets, we are now stepping into the incredibly powerful, vastly wealthy royal courts of France's Sun King and the English monarchy. Over in 17th century France, the major art patron was, without a doubt, King Louis XIV. He wanted to project absolute authority, and he did so by building a gigantic palace and garden complex at Versailles, complete with sweeping vistas and sumptuous furnishings. To pull off this massive undertaking, he employed architects like Charles Lebrun and Jules Hardouin-Mansart. What's really fascinating here is how these architects successfully married the dynamic, theatrical energy of the Italian Baroque with much more orderly, structured French classical styles. The result was a monumental complex strictly dedicated to projecting royal power. In French painting, classical structure also reigned supreme. The leading proponent of this was Nicolas Poussin. Poussin championed what he called the grand manner of painting. For him, art shouldn't be about gritty, everyday scenes like Caravaggio painted. It called for heroic or divine subjects. His classical compositions were highly structured and rational, with figures meticulously modeled on ancient statues from antiquity. Finally, we conclude our regional tour across the Channel in England, where architecture was arguably the most important 17th century art form. The master architect here was Christopher Wren. His design for the new St. Paul's Cathedral in London, which was built between 1675 and 1710, is brilliant. It perfectly harmonizes the strict architectural principles of the Renaissance architect Palladio, the energetic domes of the Italian Baroque, and the rational order of French classicism. He brought it all together to create a uniquely English synthesis. Which leaves us with a final, rather provocative thought. Throughout this lecture, we've clearly seen how the Catholic Counter-Reformation, Protestant independence, mercantile wealth, and absolute monarchs completely dictated the art of their respective regions. Art is a living product of its environment, for sure.
So as we look ahead to the next century, I want you to ask yourselves, if politics and religion shaped the 17th century so drastically, how will the impending democratic and industrial revolutions shape the art of the 18th century? Keep that question in mind as you review your notes. Thank you so much for joining me for this overview lecture, and I look forward to exploring that very question with you in our next session.